Are you a fan of pro wrestling, comedy, and combat sports? Then we have the podcast for you because we cover that and much, much more.
Do you like to debate with your friends? Do we have the perfect segment for you? It's the 531, where we take any given subject, break it down to a top 5. From there, we debate it down to 3 and then into that number 1 spot.
If you want to get a hold of us, find us on our social medias. Search Working Fans Podcast on any major social media platform. And if you want to find the podcast, search for us on any major podcast platform, as well as YouTube.
Working Fans Podcast. We put in the work so you don't have to.
Welcome back to episode 156 of the Working Fans Podcast. As always, we are brought to you by the Pro Wrestling Vault Volume 1 and Lance by Chance, available at WrestleVille.com. Super Vows, Pas de Deux, both written by Kevin Kelton, and I'll Be Here All Week, written by Ward Anderson, all available on Amazon.com. We are brought to you by our pro wrestling commentary home of New Heights Wrestling. And this week, we have a big guest for you. He is the host of Shut Up and Wrestle on the Arcadian Vanguard Network. He is a contributor to Pro Wrestling Illustrated and Inside the Ropes magazines. He has written the books WWE Legends, Pro Wrestling FAQ, and his newest book, Blood and Fire, the unbelievable real-life story of wrestling's original Sheik. He is an author, pop culture critic, wrestling historian, the great Brian R. Solomon. Brian, how are you doing today?
Wow, thanks, Joe. I'm doing really well. I'm the great Brian R. Solomon. The great Brian Last might have something to say about that, but I'm glad to be here and I'm glad to be considered great. So thank you.
Hey, we are happy to have you here because you just wrote the book about the original Sheik, and that led us to wondering, when did your pro wrestling fandom start and who were some of your early favorites?
Well, my answer to that is always kind of dull because I wish I had a different kind of response. But I came in when so many people my age came in. I'm 47 years old. I started really getting into wrestling in 1987 in the build up to WrestleMania 3. So I'd known about it and I knew kids that liked it before that. You know, you'd hear people talking about it at school, Hulk Hogan, WrestleMania and all that stuff, the first WrestleMania. But I got into it myself in that whole Andre the Giant turning on Hulk Hogan, watching Piper's Pit. In fact, one of my earliest memories of just turning it on, you want to talk about conversion moment, watching the Piper's Pit when Andre the Giant turned on Hulk Hogan and ripped the crucifix off his chest with Bobby the Brain Heenan there and it gloating and everything. That was just like, okay, I'm in. I don't know what this is, but I'm in, and I'm going to watch it again next week and the week after that. So that was it. My early favorites, I mean, I know this sounds weird, but probably my first favorite wrestler was Ken Patera. And it wasn't even the great heel Ken Patera when he was actually really good. It was when they brought him back when he got out of jail. Because, again, I'm 12. I'm just starting to watch this. I don't even know who he is or what he did to go to jail. I just thought it was fascinating. This guy who came out of jail, he wasn't a good guy. He had he'd done some bad things. And now, as Vince McMahon would say every 5 seconds, he has paid his debt to society. That got me. Like, I know that's considered, it's not really one of the great characters in wrestling, but I liked him. Also, when Bam Bam Bigelow came in as a baby face with Oliver Humperdinck as his manager, and he's doing cartwheels in the ring. The guy's like 350 pounds. He was a favorite. Very quickly later in that year when they turned Randy Savage face, he became a favorite. I hate to say it now, but Ultimate Warrior at the time, because again, I was a child. That would be in my own opinion, the only excuse for being a fan of the Ultimate Warrior. I never was a huge Hulk Hogan fan. I always wanted him to lose in those days. I couldn't wait to see who the next champion was going to be, you know. But those were my early favorites.
I just real quick, Brian, I was gotta say, I love everything you're saying. Come on, that I identify with their fandom so much. I don't usually, but just to you know what I'm talking about. Anyone wants to look it up. The Bobby Heenan Ken Patera debate where Patera whips him with the belt, and it's unbelievable the bump Bobby takes in that. And it's amazing.
Yeah, but that's another thing that, from the point of view of a child, right? I know exactly what you're talking about. The Bobby Heenan Ken Patera debate in the ring with the podiums and everything, where they were the things that Bobby Heenan was saying, they were bleeping out.
Yes.
And on the bottom of the screen, it said something like, due to the heinous nature. I remember the word heinous. Due to the heinous nature of Bobby Heenan's comments, you know, they're not fit for television or something like that. Now, I'm sure that wasn't actually the case. However, as a kid, again, I'm just like, what is he saying? Oh my God, what could be that bad that they won't allow it on television? Oh my God, what could he be saying? This is how you make a lifelong fan, with things like that. It's so simple.
And it's funny, it sounds like we all got hooked around that same time, because my earliest memories of wrestling are Hulk Hogan. And now that I've gone back and watched old superstars of wrestling, I remember the intro with Hogan in the tunnel at MSG waiting to come out. And just that early, you know, you got the Rock and Wrestling cartoons, that all just brought me in. And Hogan was an early favorite. And I talked with somebody last night at work how, you know, Hogan and Warrior were early favorites of a lot of people. And as you get older, you almost don't want to say it, because if you're a fan of wrestling, their styles were very limited. They could do what they could do, but you wouldn't necessarily call them an in-ring great.
Well, here's the thing with those two guys. And over the years, it's weird what's happened with my opinions of things. So as I became an adult and learned more about wrestling, I actually grew to like and respect the Ultimate Warrior as a worker less. However, I grew to like and respect Hulk Hogan as a worker, maybe not as a person always, but I want to point that out, but as a worker more than I did back then.
Mm-hmm.
And I really feel like those two guys are very different in the sense, I mean, neither one of them is going to do any kind of chain wrestling or put on some kind of like mat wrestling clinic. They don't need to. The difference is Hogan had a power over fans that stood the test of time, and it lasted years and years, where he could hold them in the palm of his hand. And there is something to be said for that. Whatever he was doing, it was working, and he knew how to do it. He was also very underrated as a promo. A great promo. Ultimate Warrior, not. And I know there's people who love Warrior promos, and I guess maybe if you first saw something when you were 7, you're never going to let go of how great it was. But like Hogan told me once himself when I was interviewing him, he goes to me, and I've told this story before, but he's like, you know, I always get criticized for my working style, and it's limited, and I don't do a lot of technical stuff. And he goes, guys like Guerrero, Benoit, you know, this was 20 years ago, Malenko and Mysterio, those guys, they move around the ring like lightning. They're flying everywhere. They're doing a million moves a second. The audience goes insane, loses their mind. And then he goes, you know what? I do this. And the response is identical, if not more, from the audience. So he goes, why should I do what they do? They do what they do. I do what I do. They couldn't do what I do. And I could not argue with that. He had a point. He knew what he was doing. The Warrior was much more limited, where that act grew stale very quickly. I mean, he came on the scene at the end of 87. He got super hot, 88, 89. He beats Hogan. And then it kind of just starts to fizzle away, like as soon as he wins the belt. So he really was not the second coming of Hulk Hogan, like a lot of people thought he would be. I mean, they used to joke about how he was already blown up by the time the bell rang, which is very true because of his whole ring entrance. He just was not trained the same way. I mean, Hogan was trained by some really legit people. He just knew what he had to do and what he didn't have to do. He's a lot like the Sheik, the guy I wrote the book about. The Sheik could do it all. He could tie you in knots. He was an amateur wrestling champion in the Army as a young man. He just knew he didn't have to do that. He worked a limited style. It worked. He drew more money than anybody else. That's smart in my estimation.
Absolutely.
Very
It's
much
a long
so.
answer. I'm sorry. That's a very
That's
long
all right.
answer.
No, that was great. Yeah. I mean, you do hear about like guys like I think another one like as a kid, I probably didn't like him because I was a kid, but like Jerry Lawler. But then you see how much Jerry Lawler got out of a crowd with just a little. And as an adult, if you really separate from even pro wrestling as a fan, like the idea of getting the most out of anything you do for a little is like that's that's a great life thing right there.
Jerry Lawler was very believable. He threw probably some of the best punches that there ever were. He was a fantastic brawler. He didn't look like you would look at him and go, well, he just, he's from that era. But I think he also benefited from being where he was. The skinny on Lawler even back then was he's happy to be a big fish in a small pond. And I sometimes wonder what would have happened if he did more touring, if he went to more territories and things. He might have got lost in the shuffle because whenever he goes somewhere else, he's kind of a few notches down. He's not like somebody like a Dusty Rhodes or Ric Flair or Andre the Giant, or, when they go places, they're still massive wherever they go. Not really the case with Jerry Lawler. I mean, there was the AWA because they had the working arrangement with Memphis. But for the most part, like, he stayed in his area. He was a huge deal there, a legend to this day. And that was smart in and of itself. And that helped to get himself over.
1,000%.
Yeah. Now, how do you go from being such a big fan of wrestling to working for the WWE? Because that has got to be almost like a mind-blowing experience in itself.
Yeah, it was mind-blowing because it was almost like you couldn't have scripted it more. It was almost like a screenplay of a movie or something because of all the people. Like, I was that one person that everybody knows that's like, oh my God, that guy is just nuts about pro wrestling. He never shuts up about it. He just thinks about it constantly. I'm writing about it in college and things. So I was like the ideal person that could ever happen to. Like I said, it was almost like a movie. But it was a very mundane way that it happened. I was just, I took a job out of college. I wanted to be a writer and editor when there was much more of a future in magazines and book publishing and this is the late 90s. And I was doing, just non-wrestling stuff. It was reference books and very like nonfiction kind of academic almost stuff. And my heart was in wrestling. I had done some of that in as a kid, like on neighborhood papers and college newspaper and things like that. And I was looking for a better job. I had just gotten married and I found it in the classified section of the New York Times. Just the most simple thing. There was a WWF scratch logo in the classified section of the New York Times, drew my attention. You do not see that in the New York Times classified section all the time. You don't see the New York Times classified section anymore. But I applied to it. They made me jump through a million hoops. My first interview was October 1999, and I didn't start until Valentine's Day 2000. So it was this whole multiple interviews, multiple trips from Brooklyn to Stamford, Connecticut. At first, I didn't get it. They gave it to somebody else. Then they called me back. They needed another person. It was this whole convoluted thing. But again, it's like I'm going into Titan Tower. I'm being interviewed and I'm just going like, I can't believe this is happening. This doesn't feel real. And I'm like praying. I'm like, I don't know if anyone's listening to this. I don't know if this works or not. I'm going to try it. Just if there is some karma in the universe, maybe could I get this job? Because even while I'm going through it all, I'm thinking like, I'm not getting this. This is not going to happen. But at least I could say I went there, whatever. But it actually happened. It was like so surreal.
Now, what was the experience working there? Because, I mean, we hear a lot that TV is chaotic. Does the magazine operate in the same way? Or what can you say about your time overall?
So I always have to clarify that because it is two worlds. And there's TV and there's corporate. And we weren't even in the same building, just to be clear. So there's a TV, the Titan Tower that everybody knows, that big building on I-95 in Connecticut with the big flag and everything, the giant glass box,
Yeah.
Those are the corporate offices. That is not where TV is produced. That's where all the suits are, So like TV production is down the road. It's about a 10-minute drive into downtown Stamford. Titan Tower is not in downtown. It's kind of outside in a residential area, which is very weird. But it's this little studio, nondescript. You would miss it if you were driving by. And it's a little like, it looks like I don't know,
Almost like a warehouse of sorts.
it does look a little like a warehouse, yeah. And you go, and that's where the TV was produced. I would go there occasionally for things that I had to do, but that's not where I worked. And you know, it was a different environment. It was working in Titan Tower. It was weird because there were two sides of it. So it was very corporate. You did feel like you were working for a media corporation. It didn't necessarily have that hectic feel of TV production, but it's also the world of wrestling. So underneath the surface of that corporate, very like kind of, you know, button down thing, there is the kind of how do I put this? the underbelly of the wrestling business, the stuff that makes it into Dark Side of the Ring, you know. That mentality, it crosses over from the road, it crosses over from TV, and it kind of permeates everything. So I don't want to characterize it as being like any other corporate environment. It was not. So it was like a weird blending of those two worlds, if that makes sense.
Yeah, wrestling's always seemed weird. It's almost like the carnival going legit. So it's like you're always going to want to have those people that want to run it like a business, but in the end, it's always the carnival. So you can't get out of that kind of mind state at times. Now, have you always been a writer? Because you said you wrote articles even for like your childhood neighborhood papers. What was the first article you wrote and what was it about? Do you remember?
Well, I mean, even in my high school paper, I was already writing because I knew I wanted to be a writer. I didn't necessarily know I wanted to do like hard journalism. I was always on the fence about that. But because I don't know if I could be that much of a jerk. Like you kind of have to be a jerk and really like be aggressive and kind of put people's humanity sometimes aside to get your story. And I don't always know if I had that in me, but I like to write and I love to read. So in my high school paper, I would write little things, you know, just I think the first thing I ever saw with my name in print was an article in the high school newspaper, the Severian Clipper newspaper, which was about a blood drive that they had at the high school. I mean, like very exciting. But I also had a cartoon that I would do called The Wisdom of Solomon. And those were like the first times that I officially saw myself in print. And it wasn't just, I mean, as a kid, I was making my own books and things like, you know, on paper. Like I even as a small child, maybe 10, 11, 12, I started trying to do like a neighborhood newspaper. I don't even want to call it that. It was basically a couple of pieces of paper printed out on a Commodore 64 dot matrix printer where I would, you know, the stop sign on the corner of 65th Street got hit by a car and knocked over, and I'll be following up on when it's going to be repaired. Or, you know, my grandfather took a dip in a swimming pool for the first time in 50 years. And here's what he had to say, you know, like that. But I still had the instinct of wanting to do that kind of thing. But really, it really took off when I was in college because I pitched doing a wrestling column for the Brooklyn College Kingsman paper, and it was called Wrestling Lowdown. And this was in the era of kayfabe, really, the internet. I wasn't even on the internet yet. This is 1994. I was getting my information from phone hotlines and early fanzines and things like that. I did that. And I was also, we had neighborhood papers, the Home Reporter and the Brooklyn Spectator. And I was volunteer, no money. I was taking my own pictures, black and white photography, and going to local indie shows. Some of these were Savoldi shows in the New York area or Tommy D shows. Those were two guys that were running a lot of shows, indie shows in New York in those days. And I was timing the matches, doing it all. But I thought that was going to directly lead to anything, and it didn't, because there was like a 3-year break, and then all of a sudden I'm working for WWE because I was sending clippings out to wrestling magazines, to newspapers, and not really knowing how any of that worked. And it really went nowhere at that time when I was in college. But then all of a sudden, like I said, I'm working for WWE.
Wow. Now, Dave and I have realized recently that sometimes to get paid for what you like to do, you do it for free for a while. You know, you do it for the love of it, to get those reps in, to gather the skills that you're going to need when you get to that spot. So it seems like everything you were doing and everything in your blood was leading you up to becoming an author.
It kind of felt that way. It did for a while. I was really gratified. It felt like there was like an arc to my life, like a character in a movie, like I've said. After I left WWE, though, I kind of was adrift for a while for trying to find what I wanted to do. And, I wanted to get away from wrestling for a while, honestly. I got a little sick of it, a little burnt out, a little disillusioned. And I would still occasionally contribute to PWI, but I was doing all kinds of other things. I was working in higher education. I was doing marketing. I was working for, I was marketing for Edible Arrangements Corporation, just technology news, just whatever, you name it. Health insurance. I went to work for a health insurance company doing like copy and stuff for them. But it all involved writing or marketing. And when I started feeling I was getting too into the marketing thing, which I didn't want to be, that's when I decided to become a teacher. And I did that for a few years, got certified, enjoyed it. Then I started getting pulled back into the wrestling stuff with more of the books. That's where I started to get back into it with Pro Wrestling FAQ in 2014 and 2015.
Brian, writing obviously is such a passion for you, but would you say I'm guessing the answer is obviously yes, but like therapeutic too, like almost like just this good creative outlet, for you as well, like mentally?
Yeah, I'm not one of those people, some people will say, I don't care if anybody reads this. This is just for myself. That's not me. I want as many people to read it as possible. I enjoy having a voice that can connect with people. And so actually when I was at WWE, you get very spoiled by that. Everything you write is being read, by, if it's a magazine, probably hundreds of thousands of people. If it's the website, millions of people. So I got used to that. And so when it ended, I tried to find initially another outlet. So I wound up for a few years there, from about 2007 to about 2011, 2012. I dove into the world of horror movies, actually, because that was another great love of mine. That with wrestling, they kind of go hand in hand in a way. And I built a whole website. I became a notable voice at the time in like the early horror blogosphere. I had a podcast when podcasts weren't even a thing yet. And I did that for a number of years until the wrestling kind of came back into my life again. And then that took a backseat. But the reason I was doing it was, again, as I had this need, I wanted to reach people, because I was working, my day job after WWE was very dreary. I was working for a technology news company, which was all about Google hits. And so they were doing the worst kind of, especially back in those days, the kind of SEO things that would kind of spamming, just all this horrible stuff to try to get as many Google hits as you could get. And it was dreary work. I'm cranking out like 7 articles a day about like a new kind of Skype phone that's coming out. And I'm like, who cares about this crap? And so I went into the horror movie stuff as an outlet, to kind of get heard and get seen again. And that kind of carried me for a while until I got back to the wrestling.
I love that you love the horror movies. I got on my Creep Show shorts right now. Do you have a particular horror movie that stands out as a favorite, or what's in your top 3?
My favorite horror movie was always, for most of my life, it was the original Dawn of the Dead, the 1978 George Romero movie, the sequel to Night of the Living Dead, because I saw it as a teenager and it just creeped the hell out of me.
So good.
It's very good. As I get older, this is sacrilegious, it hasn't quite totally held up for me. Like I watched it a couple times in recent years, and it has less of an impact. I would say The Shining is probably my number 1. That's a movie that has 100% held up for me, and it's probably, if I had to say the best made horror movie of all time, it would be that one. That's a big one for me. I love the old Universal monster movies. Again, those like Saturday, Sunday afternoons, syndicated TV in New York. It was like wrestling monster movies, horror movies. So like all the Hammer stuff, all the Universal stuff, 30s, 40s, 50s. I loved all that stuff. Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein. Those are on my list. Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I mean, the original one. I could go all day on that topic. Nosferatu, even this, which just turned 100 years old this year, and I rewatched it, and it's still one of the best horror movies ever made 100 years later.
I'm looking forward to that remake they're doing of it.
That's right. I don't know what happened with it because I thought, isn't that the one where Doug Jones is playing the vampire?
I believe so. I heard a lot more about it, I'd say like a year ago, and then it kind of dropped off. So I don't know if it was set to release later this year or what happened, but anything like old school horror, like for me, it's Creepshow 2 with that raft.
Right. And so, of course, Creepshow was inspired by those old EC horror comics of the 50s. So, like, you know, that's something made in the 80s, but totally inspired by horror comics of the 50s. And, you know, that's another thing. I love sampling things. It's my same mentality I apply to wrestling. I don't confine myself to just what I know from my own lifetime, my own experience growing up. Like a lot of people just get stuck in a mindset of what I grew up with is the only thing that's cool or good. Anything after it sucks, anything before it sucked. I've never taken that attitude. I try to cherry pick the best of all different eras. I really do with everything that I get into.
Yeah, it seems a lot like you're interested in the wrestling history. So how did you get involved with the Arcadian Vanguard Podcast Network? Because Brian Last is very much wrestling history, and he's kind of cultivated this nice collection of shows that, to me, they're all must listen.
I think he's doing really great work, and that's what attracted me to him because there's a lot of wrestling podcasts. There's a lot of content being created, and what he was doing really stood out, and it was something no one else was doing. I got especially pulled in by the 605 Super Podcast, and I've told him this because you had this essentially like a magazine style format show just focused on different aspects of wrestling history and done in a very intelligent way by people who really knew their stuff. And then you also had comedy on top of it, almost like Howard Stern, the classic era of Stern type of comedy all together. And it was like smart comedy, like Howard Baum coming on and doing these great impressions of Magnificent Morocco and you know, King Curtis Ayukea, and just having
the top 10 is my favorite segment.
Laughing so
Barista,
hard.
Ken Patera.
Yes, hiccuping Fabulous Moolah. I would sometimes have to pull the car over. I was laughing so hard, and I kept going like, who is this for? This is so niche. I don't know who it's for, but it's definitely for me. This is hitting me directly. And right then and there, I started saying, like, I need to find a way to reach out to these guys. And like, I would like to be a part of this. I really think I could contribute. This is like, these are my people, you know? And I was a member of the Mothership Facebook group. We all started talking on there, commenting. Brian was doing one of his Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame shows where everybody debates their picks of who they voted for. I asked flat out if I could be on. I said, I think I have something to add. He invited me on. I was just a member of a panel. That went really well. He liked it. A few months later, he asked me to be a co-host, you know, because every episode of 605, there's a co-host, a rotating co-host. So I did an episode with him. That's probably the one you're talking about, where I told some crazy WWE stories. And then before you know it, I'm on the Jim Cornette Experience talking with Jim for an hour and a half about my book, which was a dream come true. Like I couldn't ask for a better support for the book than what Brian and Jim have given me. I mean, obviously he wouldn't do that if he didn't love the book. I had to, because Jim is notoriously not technologically savvy. He will be the first one to admit that, you know. I had to, and Brian helped me get this book to him because I said, you know, I think he would actually like this book. Could you help me get it to him? I really think this would be something he would enjoy. I had to print it out, the entire book. I went to a Staples. I printed it out. It was like 3 reams of printer paper. And I mailed it in a big box, paid for the shipping, the whole thing. And I said, you know what? And we bound it. It couldn't even, so many pages, it couldn't be bound in one binding. It was 2 bindings. It was like a 2-volume encyclopedia, but it was worth it to get it to him and to get his feedback and to hear how much he loved it. someone of his stature. I have a lot of respect for him in the wrestling business. I was completely overjoyed and thrilled. And from there, my podcast happened because I announced that for years I've been thinking, I want to do my own podcast. I don't know what it would be. It would be something old school. I think I could pull this off. And I'm going like, I don't know, how would I get it off the ground? Who's going to listen? How do I publicize it? So when I started going on Jim's show and Brian's show, I started thinking, well, my profile's been raised a little bit more now than it ever has been since I worked for WWE. Like, people are remembering me again. This might be the moment to do it. Like, I have more of a name value. So I started testing the waters on Twitter, going like, hey, would anybody be interested if I did a podcast? And Brian reached out to me almost immediately. And he was just like, you have to do this with me. Like, if you do this with anybody else, like, you're nuts. And I'm going like, wow, I never in a million years would have even thought you would want my show on your network. Like I never presumed that. Who am I? I'm some guy that used to write for WWE magazine 15 years ago. So what? But he liked having me as a guest. He thought it would be a great podcast. He offered to host it. I immediately said yes. How could you say no? I mean, what a great platform to have, a built-in audience, and it's definitely helped get it off to a fantastic start. I'm flattered by the confidence that he's shown in me, and just thinking that it would be worth taking a chance on it. So, that was a very cool thing that happened.
So it would be a dream to end up on the Arcadium Vanguard podcast network, because it's such a tight-knit community. Everybody's like-minded. Like, we're getting Vandal Drummond on for our next episode just because he is such a character.
He's awesome. Yes.
And we had to bring him on. But Dave, you were going to say?
Oh, I was just curious. The podcast, Shut Up and Wrestle, I think you might have explained this before too, but for our audience who hasn't heard, I'm just curious, how did you end up using that name?
So I want to clarify that. I'm glad you asked me that. This was not a setup that I planned in advance. Just want people to know that. But because there have been people who have been like, oh, you ripped this off. And Eric Bischoff, just because when I started it was just like a few weeks, pure total coincidence, after Eric Bischoff made that infamous statement to Tony Khan, shut up and wrestle, criticizing AEW. And people were saying, well, this is like Arcadian Vanguard is trying to sort of like feed off of what Bischoff did. And even though, Bischoff's on another network, so they're trying to, it was none of that. It was, I wish I had the ability to plan things out that well, where it's a phrase. I'm not saying I invented it. And I said this on the podcast because I know that Harley Race's World League Wrestling used that as their catchphrase. There is a wrestling promotion in New England that uses that as their catchphrase. And we've seen signs in the audience that have said that for years, going back years. What it comes from is in 2002, I wrote a column for WWE.com, which got me in a lot of hot water on the early pre-social media message board internet. And it was called Shut Up and Wrestle. Shane McMahon had asked all of us columnists to get edgy and really write like some controversial things. I don't know if he expected me to go as far as I did. And I wrote a column talking about how what everyone was thinking, there's too much talking on these damn shows. Like, when is there going to be action? This was in the era of Triple H opening every show with a 15-20 minute promo every week. It was horrible. I'm sorry. And I called it out in the column, and it was called Shut Up and Wrestle. And it was like my 15 minutes of fame at the time. Everyone was talking about it, chiming in. Is this guy going to get fired? And then it was hilarious because people were on both sides saying, clearly this is a work. Clearly they set him up to write this. And then you had other people saying, no, he's going to get fired. He's a renegade. And it was neither of those things. It was absolutely not a work. It was just probably a sign of some internal disorganization that they were letting us write whatever we wanted. I wrote it completely of my own accord. I did not get into serious internal trouble. Kevin Kelly and Tom Pritchard called me out on Bite This. That was about as hot as it got, where they were like teasing that I was going to get fired. There was absolutely no talk of that. I don't even think Shane ever even read it. We were that far under the radar. But I took that name with me over the years. I had a column on the internet years ago. I think it was on onewrestling.com that I called Shut Up and Wrestle. When I was, in various places I've used it. And so I just wanted to bring it back for my column for like the 12 people that might still remember and associate that phrase with me. that is where it came from, the column that I wrote 20 years ago. That's it.
Just real quick follow up too. When you write that, and Shane is telling you guys to get more edgier, so you know you're going to write this. Is there still some trepidation in your mind, like I don't know if I should do this, but you're like, all right, whatever. Let's just see where this lands.
Yes. Yeah, there was. He took us all in a room because he was in charge of magazinesn.com. And I remember exactly what he said. He said, I consider all of you here, talking to the writers, your talent. Just like the talent on TV, you are my talent. You work for me, and as writers, you're talent. And I want you to be characters. I want you to make your name known. I want you to write things that will get people talking, not just kind of boring, bland, vanilla stuff. So I took him seriously. There were other ones that I did too. I did one. This was in the era of Billy and Chuck, where I forget what I wrote, but it was something about that, which I was trying to get really edgy. And this was in a time when in the mainstream, people weren't even really talking nearly as much as they are today about LGBT issues. And I was talking about how I can't remember even what my take on it was now that I think about it, if it was positive or negative, but like I weighed in on that. There were a lot of ones like that. I was like talking about Bruno Sammartino when nobody was allowed to even mention his name at that time, and how he was the greatest WWE champion of all time. And, we weren't even allowed to talk about him. So I was doing things like that. And the Shut Up and Wrestle one was the one that stuck because I think a lot of people agreed with it at the time, and I also thought with the podcast, honestly, the kind of irony I appreciated of calling a podcast where all you're doing is talking about wrestling, calling it Shut Up and Wrestle, because we never actually shut up and wrestle. So I thought it had like a clever, whatever, double meaning. I don't know.
Now, how are you enjoying podcasting? Is it what you thought it would be when you got into it?
It totally is, because it's what I wanted it to be, because I made it what I wanted it to be. I thought I just want to have conversations with people. One of the things that made me want to do it was I started years ago even thinking, you know what? I know enough people in the industry I'm at least acquainted with, friendly with, on a conversational basis with, that I could accumulate a long list of guests without having to ever cold call people or reach out to people that don't know who I am and have to introduce myself and cross my fingers. Like, I know enough people where I could just go, hey, Blue Meanie, what are you doing next Friday? You want to be on my podcast? I could do things like that. I could do, hey, Bill Apter, you want to do my show? And he'll, yeah, sure. Like that kind of thing. That, because I'm lazy, the path of least resistance, I figured this is going to be pretty easy. And also, people that I've spoken to before, because I just wanted it to be a conversation like we might have even when we're not being recorded, and just happen to hit record. That's all it is. It's not really an interview. If you listen to them, it's very conversational. We just go wherever it leads me. I don't have a structure. Sometimes people are like, is it okay if we talk about this now? I'm like, talk about whatever you want. There are even times where I've gone off the path of wrestling per se. Like I had David Marquez on there, the promoter, and he's very much like me. He's got an interest in showbiz history in general. And so we got off talking about like connections of wrestling with like vaudeville and old movies and just where comedy and where it all like meshes.
Disney.
And yeah, Disney, right? Because Dave used to work for Disney. And so like that was one of my favorite ones, but that's what I wanted it to be. And that's what it's turned out to be. I mean, it's all about the guests. It's getting the right people to come on. And that's, that's what's made it work.
It's fascinating. Like the older you get, you find out how much stuff actually is a work and borrows from like pro wrestling. You're like, oh, I've seen this before.
Yeah. Or how much, pro wrestling was a part of the showbiz world at one time in a much more interconnected way. And in a way, everything else kind of moved on, and wrestling still existed in this little old school bubble by itself. But it used to be much more connected, like all the terms like finish and babyface and heel and high spots and going over, like those things were used in vaudeville. They were used in the circus. They were used in like comedy, writing and things, and wrestling kind of still retained all of it, but those are the kind of like conversations that I wanted to have, just something on that was different from what other people were doing on a different level, and also to keep it focused on old school stuff not really the modern stuff. Not that I don't enjoy it, but I wanted to talk about the old school stuff and the topics related to whoever the guest may be. So if I have Jeff Walton on, who used to be Mike LaBelle's right-hand man in the LA wrestling office, we're going to talk about California wrestling. You know, I just had Scott Teal on. That hasn't even come out yet, but we got to talk about Nick Gulas and wrestling in Tennessee and the split with Jerry Jarrett and all that stuff, because he was there, you know. So it's based on who the guest is. That's where the conversation goes.
It's funny that you bring up Dave Marquez, because he is probably our greatest lost interview. The whole time we were doing the interview,
Oh no.
he blew our mind with just each thing he said. Like, he went on this huge thing about Disney that I'm like, I never would have thought like to equate that with wrestling. And then we went back, the audio was lost. And I'm like, God, that, because one of the things we've done with this podcast is just talk to independent wrestlers, talk to different personalities about their experiences in wrestling. And you get to hear different people's inspirations, what they like, and it's all going to be different. So it's getting that like wrestling potpourri out there. Now, being into wrestling history, who are some of the wrestling historians that you admire, both that came before you and that you've dealt with?
I would have to say, working now, currently alive and doing their thing, Tim Hornbaker is the man. Tim Hornbaker is somebody also who inspired me to go, you know what? I want to take a shot at this. You know, not that I've been writing for years, but like, I love wrestling history. I love writing. How about writing about wrestling history, you know? And so like his NWA book is, to me, I'm not the first one to say this. I think Meltzer said it. Like, if you were teaching a class about the history of pro wrestling, that would be the textbook you would give your students. I mean, like, it's perfect. And I've read everything he's done. I read the Capitol Revolution book about the early history of the WWF. I read Death of the Territories. My God, what a good book. The Buddy Rogers biography that just came out, beautiful. For me, his research and the rigors of what he goes through is the gold standard. It's the high watermark. And so whenever I work on books, I always reach out to him, and he always has these nuggets of gold that he'll send my way. There's a couple of letters that I used in the Chic book that came from him, like letters between the promoters. So he's one. I mentioned Scott Teal. I mean, he's doing the Lord's work with all the biographies that he's put out. I think he's probably put out more books about wrestling than any other human being who's ever lived. And in terms of like the autobiographies that he's co-written and things like that, I mean, he's got to have a record. There was a book that this guy's no longer with us, but Jim Friedman, who wrote the book Getting Heat, or actually it's called not Getting Heat. Oh, this is terrible. I should remember. Drawing Heat, which is, now Jim Friedman was a professor, I think like psychology or something like that, who also happened to be a wrestling fan and knew a lot of people in the business. And in the 1980s, he went on the road in Ontario, going to all these different like Ontario indie promotions in that era, like Dave Bearman McKigney was running. And like, he got to hang out with all the wrestlers. He got the Sheik to open up. He's the only person that ever did that. And I used that book extensively, but his book, I think because he was also an academic and maybe a wrestling outsider and not so much a wrestling historian, that's probably the best written wrestling history book that I've ever read in terms of just the writing style itself. It's on a whole other level. Indispensable. I mean, there's just so many people. Steve Yohe has done incredible work as a historian. So many people that I have kind of stood on their shoulders to do what I did. There's no way that you can do this kind of thing without building on what people have done before you.
Now, speaking of doing what you did, we've got the book Blood and Fire, the unbelievable real life story of pro wrestling's original Sheik. And I'm just going to read Jim Cornette's words from the back of the book, because I don't know if you can get a more powerful endorsement than this. Jim says, I have never learned more about any pro wrestler from any single book than I did from the tour de force that is Blood and Fire. The veil of secrecy the Sheik shrouded his life and career in has been lifted by Brian Solomon's painstaking research. A book on pro wrestling's most mysterious figure has never been attempted, now that one has finally been written. It can never be followed. like its subject, the book is one of a kind. Wrestling fans should read it twice. What did you think when he sent you that? And
Yeah.
like, how proud are you to put that on the back of the book?
I couldn't believe it because I sent him, like I told you, the printed out copy. I heard from Brian how much he was loving it and was blown away by it, wanted to have me on his show. But I remember I reached out to him by email at one point just to make sure he had gotten it. And he got back to me immediately. And he was just like, I'm going to, once I'm done, I'm totally done with it. Or I forget how he put it. He was just like, I'm going to like, what's the best way to reach you? I'm going to like come up with a blurb for you for the book. And then is it okay to curse on this show?
Oh, yeah.
Because we're talking about Jim Cornette.
Yeah.
Then he goes, you know what? Fuck it. I have something right now. I'm so excited about this book. I'm just going to put it in the body of this email. I'm not even going to wait. And he wrote the blurb that is on the back of that book. And I couldn't believe it. And I forwarded it. I thanked him, of course. I forwarded it to the publisher, ECW Press, and they even were flabbergasted. And I remember that Mike Holmes, the editor there, he said something to me like, I hope you realize, I hope you appreciate and understand what a rare and glowing review this is from such a high profile and trusted individual. This is a very special thing you have here for the book. I think he almost wanted to put it on the front, and I was very appreciative, and I've never stopped being appreciative. I've thanked Jim and Brian a million times. I sent Jim a whole like gift basket of goodies. I was just so overwhelmed. I just felt like I have to make it clear to these guys, especially Jim, I mean, for that blurb, how appreciative I am. I don't want them to think I was just like, yeah, whatever. Like, I want to make it very clear that I appreciate this more than you'll ever know.
I think it's amazing he got it to you in email for him, because that's probably the toughest way for him to communicate. But he likes the book so much. He's like, no, we have to do this now.
That's the thing. And he even said to me at one point, because I found his email address, I guess, on his website. And it's the email address that's used for ordering stuff from him. It's not really like his own, personal direct. So I sent it to that. And he actually said to me, no, here's my personal one. If you really want to get to me quickly, the email I check most often, which for him is probably like once in the morning, right?
Yeah.
When he opens his computer up, God bless him. He said, this is the one to use from now on. And by the way, here's this blurb, and here it is right here. I'm not even going to wait. And yeah, I was blown away. Totally.
Amazing. Now, what was the process for the Sheik book? Like, how long did it take from when you knew what you were going to write about to when you got the printed copies?
Well, excuse me. I pitched the book in the summer of 2019, and I sent just a kind of an early email to them, and they were interested in the concept. Then they asked for like a sort of like a pitch or a sample, and a formal kind of pitch, and I did that with a writing sample from which wound up being the introduction to the book, which is the fictionalized kind of vignette of the Sheik wrestling Tony Marino in Cobo Arena. That's how the book opens. That was the sample I sent, and they were sold on it immediately. And I signed my contract in November 2019, got to work. The world then proceeded to end as I was writing it. It's just getting started. So there were no trips to Detroit. There was no like legwork being done. I could barely leave my house. So for the first 6 months, it was just research from about November, December 2019 until the summer. It was interviewing people, going on Ancestry.com, going through newspaper archives, getting military records, that kind of thing. And then by the summer of 2020, I really started the hardcore writing. I was still researching, I was still interviewing people, but the hardcore writing continued for, I want to say, about 9 months. I finished the actual draft in March of 2021. And then for the next year, it was just revising, putting it in layout, getting photography, proofreading it, copy editing it. Excuse me. That's a really long process. It took longer than writing it. So, all told, the book came out in April 2022. So you're talking about almost 2.5 years of my life. Yeah.
Just a quick follow up. With the delay of everything because of COVID and stuff, did that actually maybe help you a little bit in terms of like, you had more time? You're like, all right, I'm going to do a lot more research, and did it, in a way, was it beneficial in some ways?
100% yes. And I sometimes sound callous, being like, "Yay, a global pandemic that killed millions of people! It made me write a better book." But the fact is, my day job that I had at the time, I was working for a tutoring agency on site. The pandemic killed that because in the beginning, especially before people sorted it out, everybody was so panicked. Nobody wanted to send their kids to be tutored, in a building somewhere. So like their business was drying up. They cut my hours down to almost nothing. I found myself with all this free time. I was, then they had the lockdown rules where for a couple of months there, you couldn't go anywhere except to the supermarket, right? Or the drugstore. So I said, you know what? I'm going to make the most of this. I'm trapped in this house. My day job is almost nothing at this point. So I'm going to turn this book into my day job. And I wound up saying, you know what? 9 to 5, like a job. I'm going to go down into my office from 9 in the morning to 5. God bless my wife, who was also unemployed at the time, or working freelance assignments from home, able to watch our beautiful son and do that kind of thing. And I went down here where I'm sitting right now, and I sat here for 8 hours a day, and I treated it like a job. There's no way it would have been as thorough as it was and get done as relatively quickly as it was, because if I was making it as thorough as it was with having to work a full-time job and doing it a couple of hours a night when I'm exhausted coming home, it would have taken me many years, I think 5, 6 years, maybe more to do. And because of the way everything happened, it made the book a better book. I mean, that is a fact, in my opinion. I would not have been able to say, you know what? I'm going to spend 3 hours trying to get to the bottom of this one question and figure out what the right answer is. And it'll take me down all these other rabbit holes of, oh my God, this is where he was in Europe during World War II, down to day by day, village by village, where they went. Those kind of things were the product of having a lot of free time, thankfully.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic, it kept me and Dave both in work because Dave delivers bread. At the time, I worked in a grocery store, but we had the free time because of not doing anything else, the lockdown, that we were able to put it into this podcast. And me and him think that sometimes we wouldn't have gotten the interviews we had, or we wouldn't have been able to brainstorm different ideas for the podcast without having that time.
And it's just negative into positive too. Like, like for me, my other business too, delivering bread, like my sales increase because people are just shopping. That's all they're doing. So I'm doing everything I can to, increase the money and try to, also, as Joe said too, take the interviews we can get with the podcast. And we were working twice as hard as we ever were because of that in that situation. So
it's that weird mixed blessing of the pandemic. You don't want to look at it as a positive, but
we're not like, out of it. Yay, pandemic. It's just you make it. Yeah.
It's more than even just the book. Even in just all of the wrestling aspect of my career, I was able to focus more on, because usually that would just be a luxury when I'm doing whatever god-awful thing, keeps my lights on. I'm doing that and then trying to squeeze the wrestling. Well, now I'm going full bore into my freelance writing aspects. I'm now a full-time contributor, meaning every issue, to Pro Wrestling Illustrated, Inside the Ropes magazine in the UK. Those were things I was not able to do before. I've raised my profile higher, in at least in the world of wrestling media and online and all that stuff, higher than it's been since I worked at WWE, maybe even higher, to the point where, it's led to other things. It's led to Arcadian Vanguard. It's led to possibly other books and things, and becoming a self-sustaining thing. To be able to invest the time and devote the concentration and effort and to make those things happen, you just can't do with a full-time, like especially soul-sucking kind of job. You just can't do it. And that's why all these years it's only been a little peripheral thing on the side for me. And now it's really kind of like taken over my day-to-day work, and it's all because of all the time that I had.
That's great to hear. And it's funny how when you do something that you actually love and enjoy. It feels less like work and it's more fun. What kind of inspires you to create? Like, what do you look to for inspiration when you write these books and when you do things like this?
Oh boy. Well, I mean, it has to be something I'm interested in or passionate about. I mean, every writer has that feeling when you get an assignment that you love. It's like you could do it like that. You don't even have to think about it. I mean, there are articles I write where I can sit down for I'll write like 1,000 words an hour, no joke, not even an exaggeration. And then there's ones where you're not that passionate about it, and it'll drag out for days and days, and you're procrastinating. And so I try to focus on stuff that I love, just even because it's more productive. Like even in the realm of wrestling, like with Pro Wrestling Illustrated, I created a column there. Again, big surprise, an old school column. It's called The Way It Was, but I wanted to take advantage of the incredible photograph archive that PWI has that no one else has, like up to the present day and to the beginning of the business. Like it's just an amazing archive. So that column I could do it, and I don't mean this in a negative way. I could do it in my sleep, like, because it's just part of what I am, what I love. I just did a story for PWI on the legacy of Cody Rhodes, dating back to Dusty Rhodes and Superstar Graham, all the stuff he's been talking about on TV. I wrote an article all about that and what that match was like. I watched the match, what was happening in New York City on that night in 1977. I mean, that stuff is my bread and butter. And Cody himself directly reached out to me to thank me for it. That stuff comes easy to me. It really does. And so, again, because I'm at heart a lazy man, I look for the things that are going to be easy, and they're the things that I love the most. So, like, even in terms of like what to write a book about, the Sheik was something that fascinated me. His life, his persona, Detroit wrestling in general, not written a whole lot about. And so I wanted to contribute to that. So, I mean, I'm inspired by the things that I love. I mean, that's a very simple answer. The aspects of wrestling history that I enjoy and I like getting into, like even with the podcast, I could talk for hours and hours. I never get tired of it. I always have to cut it short because I try to keep it to an hour on my show. But I always feel like we could just keep going and going and going. I'm never bored. But again, it's because I talk about and write about the things that I love.
100%. Now, speaking of keeping it to an hour, we are just about at that mark. So
That was not a hint. That was not a hint. I just
no, I know. We like keeping it to an hour because there are times we can just keep on going and going. We forget we're recording. So I'm going to hit you kind of with a 3-part question. Who are some of the people that helped you most with the book? Do you have maybe another wrestling book in you at some point? And can you tell us what's on the horizon for you?
So with the book, there's a few people that need to be mentioned. I mean, the acknowledgments in the book is very long. So, but I mean, like, boil it down to the most important. There was Dave Drayson, aka Dave Brzezinski, who is like the dean of Detroit wrestling alive today. He was the Sheik's last manager. He had a direct contact to the Sheik for years. He knew him and worked with him. And he had tons of photography as well. And he was there to answer any question I had. I would send him a message at night, just, hey, how tall was the Sheik? Just random things like that. And he was always there, incredibly supportive. Also, Mark Boujan, who I have to mention, who was a leading light in terms of historians of Detroit wrestling. He was the man. He was the guy you went to with the history. He was a fan first. And he was so supportive and made a lot of contacts for me early on. He also passed away during the writing of the book. And that was very sad for me because he was so excited about seeing the finished product. He never got a chance to. So he was one of the people that I dedicated it to for sure. I mentioned Tim Hornbaker. He sent me some great archival stuff. The people that I interviewed, I mean, Terry Funk was great. Kevin Sullivan was great. I got a hold of Flying Fred Curry, who is alive and well and living in northern Connecticut, not far from me, and probably the person living who has wrestled the Sheik more times than anyone else alive, for sure. Priceless kind of person to be able to talk to for this book. So I have to thank him big time. Who else? Well, I mean, and as far as like looking ahead, yes, I absolutely want to write more about wrestling. Now, I just finished a book, which I don't know, I'm a masochist or something. I was doing at the same time as finishing up Chic. I was starting the next book. And it's because I pitched both at the same time and I didn't know who was going to say yes, honestly. And they both said yes. I'm like, oh my God. So I tried to space it out. But it's a book on the history of superheroes. So it's non-wrestling related, a little bit wrestling related, but it comes out next year. And it's different, but it's not wrestling. But as far as wrestling goes, I am thinking now of my next project. Now that Superheroes is done and I'm in post-production on Superheroes, my next book is definitely going to be wrestling related. I have a few things in mind that I don't want to get into too much detail because you never know. People kind of steal your ideas and things like that. But there's two ideas I have. I'll just say two possible ways to go. One is a possible book on the history of wrestling magazines that I'd like to do almost in a coffee table style, like an art book. Like, you know how you see these art books that are on pop culture, like comic books or pulp novels and men's magazines and things like that. I'm thinking, why not wrestling magazines? No one's done that. It's never been done.
That would
So
be great.
yeah, there's that. And the other thing is, do I do another biography? That could be another way to go. And I have a couple of possible ideas for that. I don't want to say who they are again, because somebody might beat me to the punch, but I will say that they're people who are very important, high profile names in wrestling history who have never had a book done about them. Like in the couple of people I have in mind, I would say that about any of them. So that's where I'm going in the future.
Now, if people want to keep up to date with what you've got going on and what these books could turn out to be, where can they find you in the social media landscape?
All right. Well, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Brian R. Solomon. Twitter's a great place, especially to follow me, where I talk a lot about the wrestling stuff. On Facebook, there's the Shut Up and Wrestle group on there. If you look up Shut Up and Wrestle with Brian R. Solomon, that's a Facebook group built around the show. I also have a Facebook page just as an author, which if you look up my name, Brian R. Solomon, there's a picture of the Sheik. That's my author page. I have an author website, which has a really unwieldy URL, but if you go to any of my social media, you'll find the links to my author website, and I keep people up to date there. And the podcast, of course. I mean, Shut Up and Wrestle, you can find it wherever you find podcasts, Apple, Google, Spotify. The website is suawpod.com. It's easy to find online.
Excellent. Well, Brian, thank you for joining us today, and we can't wait to read your next book.
Thank you very much, guys.